Greetings, fellow human. You're listening to Inside Awala, your backstage tour of this technology that helps bypass internet censorship. This show is primarily for diaspora communities from regions subject to severe censorship caused by repressive regimes, foreign militaries, or civil wars. My name is Gus Nerea. I invented Awala at the University of Oxford with the initial goal of circumventing internet blackouts by enabling apps such as Twitter to work without the internet. I later founded Relay Corp to oversee the project. This episode is about how we built the Awala network and its first compatible app between December 2019 and November 2023. Relay Corp achieved this thanks to more than $750,000, mostly from the Open Technology Fund, OTF. This enabled me to hire around a dozen freelancers at different points of this massive undertaking. Building a new computer network is a bit like colonizing a new planet. You have to build a humongous amount of infrastructure from scratch before you build the stuff that people will actually use, like the houses, the parks, and the local transport system, and then finally bring the settlers. This episode is about how we prepared Planet Awala for the settlers. This was a very hectic few years as I effectively had 2 full-time jobs. During the day, I would be working on the contract by building software, keeping the servers running, syncing with the team, and onboarding people. At night and on weekends, I would do everything else: fundraising, recruiting, reporting progress, tax reporting, etc. In fact, I only managed to take 1 proper holiday in those 4 years. I expected the implementation of Awala to be a marathon, with the odd sprint here and there, not the long sprint it turned out to be. Overall, this was far more complex and time-consuming than my most pessimistic predictions. By far, the biggest source of overrun was the integration of the third-party software that would make Awala work across platforms, such as Android and Windows. Imagine finalizing the rail system in the new planet and then shipping the trains, only to find that the rails and the trains are incompatible in this new environment. This happened far too often as we integrated components built by different organizations. Building such a big and unusual product from scratch, whilst trying to keep the budget down, also proved difficult. The funding enabled me to work full-time, but I would have to rely heavily on short-term or part-time specialists. I didn't have another option, as the different roles that I needed to hire for were highly specialized. It would have been difficult and a bit risky to try to find a generalist to fulfill several roles. This meant that I was often recruiting and onboarding, which tends to be very time-consuming in any organization, as well as painful when things don't work out. I was also a huge bottleneck for 3 reasons. Firstly, the frequent change of team members meant that I was the only person able to onboard new recruits and help them when needed. Secondly, the type of technology we're building is extremely unusual. This is called delay-tolerant networking, DTN, and it's the kind of thing that only a handful of organizations in the world build. This meant that I had to include DTN training in the onboarding, but tailor it to the speciality and background of the new hire. Thirdly, the cryptographic and networking skills needed to build something like Awala are extremely hard to find in the software industry. These people are in short supply. Finding someone qualified to help with or take over the cryptographic and networking work would have been extremely challenging, not least because they would have had to alternate between working full-time for several months at a short notice to avoid delays and being on retainer to fix issues relatively quickly. So instead of looking for that unicorn, I decided to do the cryptographic and networking work alone. This made me a bit uncomfortable though, given the sensitive nature of this work. It was like being solely responsible for designing and building the life support systems of our new planet. Getting anything wrong here could prove catastrophic and literally put people's lives at risk. I only went through with it because the work I had done on the cryptography so far had been independently audited by cybersecurity experts, and I planned for the final implementation to undergo the same level of rigor. Also, I leveraged third-party cryptographic work as much as possible. Fortunately, as it happens, the security audit for this part of the technology concluded a few weeks ago, and no major issues were found. I always knew that I was going to be a bottleneck, so one policy that I introduced early on was to delegate all non-differentiating work to third parties. I'm not just talking about the technology, but also other aspects of running the business, like filing trademark applications. For example, I'm very strict about not operating servers in-house and instead use so-called serverless services. Using serverless services isn't cheap, as we're offloading most of the server-related operations to a third-party service, but it's certainly cheaper than paying a freelancer or having me drop whatever I'm doing when things suddenly break. Specialized third parties can do a better job too. Fortunately, my clients were always supportive whenever we ran into unexpected issues. I, on the other hand, was getting pretty impatient after the second year, especially when a new internet blackout took place. Belarus, Gaza, Ethiopia, Kashmir, Sudan, and many other places went offline during this period. It really frustrated me not being able to help, and I also felt sad when people with ties to those regions contacted me to check if they could use Awala. This project really took me out of my comfort zone. I was reasonably comfortable with the cryptography and networking, but there were things that I had never done before, things that could make or break the project. For example, I had led a software engineering team, but I had never managed one. We worked on 3 contracts during this period, so let's discuss them one by one. Contract number 1. The contract with OTF started on Sunday, the 1st of December 2019. The goal of the project was to build the most basic version of Awala on desktop and Android. We would also build an internal tool just to test Awala on desktop and Android. By the end of this contract, Awala would still not be useful to the end user. In my colonization analogy, this contract was the equivalent of manufacturing and launching the rockets and eventually landing on the new planet. I kicked things off by implementing the cryptographic building blocks for a couple of months. Then I brought on the first contractor in February 2020. Our priority was to build the Android app that couriers will use to transport data between a region disconnected from the internet and a location connected to it. We finally completed the courier app in June 2020 after overcoming painful interoperability issues between the third-party cryptographic libraries that we used on Android and the ones we used on the servers. It was now time to start work on the Awala app on Android. For context, this is the app that every single Awala user needs so that they can use Awala-compatible apps with and without the internet. In Awala, compatible apps are not responsible for the transport of the data. Awala is. Unfortunately, the Trump administration defunded OTF in June 2020. I won't go into details of what happened next, but I will say that I truly admire the way that the internet freedom community and OTF specifically handled this. Also, thanks to them, I was able to continue the contract with another funder a few months later with virtually no disruption. July 2020 was a big month in terms of spreading the word about Awala. I managed to present it at RightsCon, which is probably the largest event in the internet freedom community, and I had just got accepted into Mozilla Builders, an incubator for startups trying to fix the internet. In parallel to supporting the Android work that was being led by other contractors, I was also working on the implementation of another app, the Awala Internet Gateway. This is basically something that runs on the cloud and is responsible for holding messages that should be going to people who are offline. It basically queues those messages until either the user reconnects to the internet or a courier collects the messages on their behalf. I finally finished it in September after lots of integration issues. At the end of Mozilla Builders in early November 2020, I got the wonderful news that Awala had won the first place in its group. The prize was $10,000. This really came in handy to pay for all the expenses outside the scope of the contract, which I typically have to pay for out of pocket, such as accountant and legal fees. Contract number 2. We started the year 2021 with a new funder who took over the remainder of the contract we had with OTF. January was a very important month as we had just completed the implementation of Awala on Android and were able to publish it on the Google Play Store. I recorded a demo and shared it publicly so that people could see Awala in action. I was so chuffed to have got to this point. I can neither confirm or deny whether there were tears of joy. As we wrapped up the Android work in February 2021, I turned my attention to the implementation of Awala on desktop and started recruiting for an engineer who could do this implementation whilst integrating the cryptographic and networking work I was doing. We eventually finished it in June, after significant delays on my part due to unforeseen integration issues. I spent most of the summer during 2021 wrapping up the project. It was really stressful because I thought I had very little work left, but I could not have been more wrong. I should have applied for a deadline extension, but I was absolutely sure that I had plenty of time to wrap up. Fortunately, everything was completed by the deadline. I had recently got a motorbike, or motorcycle as they call it, across the pond, and I decided to celebrate this milestone by riding around the Shetland Islands off the northeast coast of Scotland. I worked so hard that I lost track of time and left London a day early. I realized when I arrived in Aberdeen with plenty of time to board the ferry, only to find it leaving without me. Contract number 3. Things went back to normal for OTF in 2021, so early that year I was also preparing for the next funding request. It was a smooth process, which I kicked off in March and was eventually approved in August whilst I was in Shetland. I was so happy that the heavy rain on the ride back to London didn't bother me. The goal of the proposal was to lower the barrier to adopt Awala, both from the point of view of the end users and the software developers who wish to make their apps work offline. The most important output was Letro, my idea of an application like email, but using Awala to work offline. For the first time, people will actually be able to use Awala. Continuing with my planet colonization analogy, this meant building the first neighborhood on the new planet so that the first settlers can finally move in. The project started on Friday, the 1st of October 2021. The first part of the contract involved an awful lot of cryptography and networking work, so until July of the following year, my focus was improving the reliability, security, and decentralization of Awala, basically fixing all the shortcuts we had to take in the first contract. This too took a lot longer than expected, also due to interoperability issues with third-party systems. During that time, I was also keeping the servers running and supporting the part-time contractor who was maintaining the Android version of Awala. As a side note, I also started to look at everything else that needed to be done outside the scope of this contract to deliver Awala. Amongst those things was registering a trademark so that we can protect the reputation of the project. Awala was originally called RelayNet, so that's what I tried to register. However, my lawyer strongly advised against it because it was too self-explanatory. This didn't make any sense to me. Telling a software engineer that they came up with a self-explanatory name is one of the best compliments you could give them, but apparently in the context of trademarks, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So anyway, I came up with the name Awala, which means sibling in Wayu, a native South American language, as it symbolizes my goal to empower all humankind. In the summer of 2022, I was having second thoughts about one of the most important components that I had proposed for Letro. On reflection, I was concerned about the usability of my idea to make users connect with each other. We hadn't started its implementation yet, so I decided to take some time to reconsider this. Think about how you connect with the people you know online. Online platforms basically offer two options. Either you depend on a centralized user directory controlled by a company like LinkedIn, Twitter, or WhatsApp, or it's all decentralized with no user directory, as is the case with email. I didn't want Relay Corp to have to maintain a centralized user directory, since I try to stay away from any sort of gatekeeping for safety and security reasons, so that meant that whatever we do had to be decentralized. Now, the problem with decentralized user identifiers is that they have to be either computer-generated gibberish or based on domain names like your email address from gmail.com. My original plan was to go down the gibberish path, even though it's terrible for usability, simply because domain names could not work offline. So for my next magic trick, I decided to make domain names work offline. I called this project Vera and implemented a proof of concept to make sure that what I had in mind was actually feasible. After a few weeks, I managed to make everything work and began seeking feedback. With Vera in place, Litro users could identify themselves using text like aliceexample.com instead of having to share some gibberish with other people. Unfortunately, this meant taking on a smaller moonshot and requesting a change to the scope of the current contract. In this case, I had to do a lot of groundwork before I could even start implementing Vera. This groundwork took a lot longer than I expected, and I finally completed it in December 2022, which enabled me to move on with the actual implementation of Vera in the new year. I spent the first quarter of 2023 building the cryptographic foundation of Vera, and I delegated the rest to another team member. We finally completed Vera in April 2023, although by this point I had renamed the project to Vera ID due to trademark restrictions. We finally kicked off the development of Letro in May 2023, now that all the groundwork in Awala and Vera ID was complete. We started by conducting user research before starting the design of the app. The implementation of Letro began in June, and it also took a lot longer than expected. We encountered many issues, such as the integration with the Awala app. I wasn't expecting this to be problematic at all because we already had an internal tool to test Awala end-to-end. However, Letro was now using Awala in ways in which we didn't test. We finally completed the implementation of Letro in October 2023 and used the remainder of the project to produce documentation aimed at technical and non-technical stakeholders, such as journalists and independent security auditors. This is now the end of the episode. If you'd like to dive deeper into anything we discussed, check out the show notes. The next episode is going to be about bringing settlers to the new planet, that is, putting Letro and therefore Awala in the hands of people that need it, or at least trying to do that. Thank you so much for tuning in, and see you in 2 weeks.